So to get by that, I think I'm not sharing anymore. Can you guys just let me know if you can see my screen right now? Like the styled components. Cool, awesome. I see a thumbs up. I just can't see it on my screen. So we want to make our code as concise and as clear as possible, so that not only are we able to, not only does it improve readability, but it also improves browser readability. And it allows us to render our application initially much, much faster. So that's the first thing. Minimal amount of code is run. And the second aspect of it is that we have better maintenance, right? So we can easily change our styling without needing to search. And what I mean by that is that, you know, the idea of modularizing code in general, you know, write it once and don't repeat yourself, is like a very fundamental aspect of all computer programming. And the same thing applies to JavaScript. But the issue is, or the same thing applies to web applications. But the issue is that oftentimes CSS is reused, but has slight like differences in its implementation that force us to make different classes altogether. Of course, we could utilize things like subclasses in CSS to achieve similar effects. And to some degree, there's an element of inheritance. But I think one of the most important things is that we're able to, you know, able to work with entirely disparate parts of our application while using very similar CSS code. And styled components allows us to do this. So styled components gives us the ability to just wrap CSS around a component. And so if we want to change one sort of styling aspect of our application, for example, like our background styles, background color, we can just do that in one place and it'll carry over to everywhere else that uses that wrapper, that CSS style components wrapper. And then this aspect of things, which is dynamicity. It says adapting the styling of a component based on its props or global theme is simple and intuitive without having to manually manage dozens of classes. There's a lot of CSS frameworks that allow us to manage CSS in a way that's very intuitive. But styled components is really special as a React library, that it allows us to pass in whatever we want into a CSS component. Imagine like writing a CSS file and you can like pass stuff into it. And for example, like based on what the user does, it'll change the background color to something else. And if you click something else, it'll change it to something else. Instead of having, you know, different classes that manage both of those different states, we can have one class that manages multiple states by having parameters that we can pass into it. So that's a really cool part about it. Since it's all JavaScript at the end of the day, we can pass in props into our components. Yeah, they're props because they're just components at the end of the day. And this will allow us to sort of establish things like global themes, and while still having differences depending on user preference, for example, in the case of like dark mode. And there's a whole bunch of other sort of benefits that we can see right here. I really like the documentation for styled components. A lot of like really famous or really popular React component libraries like this have really good documentation. So I can say that for things like React Bootstrap, which has, you know, this, for example, just for navbar, it has like really good documentation with its own like examples of how it works. So this is like a use case for React Bootstrap and all the code that would correspond to this use case. So I really, really encourage you guys to just look through some of these things. And that in itself, you know, looking at the use cases as well as their respective code bytes will prove to be really, really useful in order to understand this stuff. So if you want to learn more about styled components, go to the styled components documentation and just like look through it, API reference, learn about all this stuff. Of course, we're going to go through a lot of this stuff today, but just for reference. And you guys might remember actually that there is a way to make styled components or make CSS inline for React. And so this idea of inline CSS is something that's been like hotly debated in the industry for a long time. And you know, inline CSS in general, whether it's just like a raw like HTML CSS website or something, you know, that is within React but still like inline. And I can give a bit of an example here. Let's see if I have the code block open. Cool. Okay, so I have code block open right here. Okay, I don't know if you guys can see this. Okay, cool. So this hopefully you guys are seeing this right now. This is one example of, I think this is kind of drawn. So this was drawn from last year's lecture, but you can see this idea of inline CSS within the application. So we have this application, this app component that has its own set of divs, and those, like for example, this nav div has its inline CSS specified here as follows. So the debate is whether this this sort of like way of doing things is following good code practices. And the general consensus is, unless you have like you know, like something that just like really small, there's I guess certain times that it would be okay to use things like just inline CSS like this, but in general it's just ugly, it's clunky. We don't want to do this because it's putting, you know, it's not allowing us to utilize all the code specification properties that React allows us to use. And in general, it's not good practice to code things, you know, hard code things into anything. So in general, we don't want to use what are called inline CSS properties, and style components allow us to not do that. Yep, so that's the basic idea behind style components in terms of just like a rote example or conceptual example. But to give sort of like a practical background for this, I guess. Let's see. Okay, me. Might have closed the tab. 1 second. There it is. Okay, so this is a code sandbox. You guys might be familiar with CodePen. Code sandbox is also super similar, but I like this one a lot. So this is like a little template, like a toy example that I found online. But I think it demonstrates the point really well. So we have this little application that we can see on the side. It has a home page. It also has other different pages like pricing, as well as like documentation. This one's, none of these other ones work, but we have like multiple pages. Basically, we have a home page and we have a pricing page, and we can navigate between the two really, really easily. One thing you might notice is that the initial load of this page is it happens pretty quickly, but what's even faster is when we navigate to like another page. It doesn't even reload the page like at all. It just navigates directly to it, and there's a good reason for that that we'll talk about. But you know, if we go on a different application that doesn't employ like React at all, we can notice that if we switch to a different page, it actually reloads everything and it loads in all the assets that are related to that page of the application. So finance.yahoo.com is a whole separate domain, but if we have, more specific pages, it reloads the page. And there is some sort of dependence on the cache. Like, for example, some of these headline articles will have, like much faster load times because they're already loaded into our cache in the initial render. But I guess the point still stands. This will have instantaneous sort of changes. And that's just a prelude for our discussion on React components. But let's go back to this. We have our application, which we initially look at our index file, which points to our app.js file. And this app component contains a router. And so that route actually points to specific components. Talk about what this means. Again, you guys don't have to worry about that for now. So if we go to components and then, we go to pages and we go to home, which is imported in app.js as well. We can see all the code for just the home page. You might be wondering, like, where is this part of this navigation bar? And if we go back to our app.js page, we see this navbar component. So we can just go straight to that component because it looks like it's the same one that points to this top navigation bar. And I just want to examine the styling for this navigation bar right here. So one way of doing things in general is to just establish each of these as separate divs or separate classes, and then construct the CSS for those specific classes on our own. So that's what this is doing. This is just saying, for example, this right here is a div. In this case, it's a link that we'll talk about as well. And the class name for this is navren. So if we go to index.css and we we find this specific class and we see all of the CSS that's associated with it. It's a cumbersome sort of strategy to employ. We have to sort of find it, and the CSS file could get really big and clunky. This is already too big. It's confusing and we don't know where things are. And so, yeah, we have these multiple class names, and we also, we can have, things like @media and @hover and different sort of things that'll make it more dynamic. We can also establish, global styles as well. Global styles is in just body and dot container, which will probably be used in multiple different locations. A better way of doing this, some would argue, is using styled components. So we'll have this same idea right here, which uses styled components to render pretty much the same application. So there we go. So this is the same application, but in a way that uses styled components. We go to the index.js file, points to app, and now we have this global style here, which for some reason is getting defined before the nav bar. So is this another component that's getting rendered here? Let's take a look. So global styles is imported from /styled/global. This is generally a really good way to do things. We should have our CSS in a distinct place from the rest of our code, even if that CSS is a styled component. So I don't want to see anybody define their components within the pages or the parts of the application that actually contain, the code that dictates the content of the front end. So just like to specify here, we don't see any styled components inside home.js. We don't see any inside pricing.js. And that's because we want to keep everything, all of these aspects of it distinct, even if it is still JS. So so let's see right here. Let's go back to app.js. Global style from styled/global, so global. And we can access global style because that is the only thing that's been exported from global.js. And this looks the same as this right here, right? Actually, no, I'm wrong. Let's go here. This looks the same as this. And they're the exact same thing. And so if you see this right here, styled link, we're passing in this link property to styles, the styled function, because link is the type of class, or the type of component, or the div type that we're attempting to modify. And link is just one sort of very special class inside, one special component inside of the package of React Router. Yeah, so we have all the same sort of specifications that we had here, but this time in styled components form. And we are exporting it so we can access it anywhere we want. And these are all of the things related to the navbar. But here we can actually, similar to how we said styled link here, we can pass in properties dynamically. Now, if you notice right here, we can also use dynamic properties in order to specify different things that relate to different devices, making cross-platform, etc. So in this case, if the device is a tablet that we're viewing this on, we make the direction of our flexbox column-wise rather than row-wise. And so that's just a one way to do things. Another thing that I want to point out right here is this way of making it very dynamic. So we have normal React components which have props passed into them. So we don't have any props here actually, but this is actually one example of. Let me see actually. Okay, so we have props that we can access here as well, and this is the general syntax on how to do them. Remember, you guys also have access to this code that you can look at later. So this is actually the completed styled version of the starter code, but you guys can convert that after this lecture by yourselves, and I strongly encourage you to do so. So this is a JavaScript function. This is a JavaScript arrow function that we're passing in. And we can always do that. We can always pass in our JavaScript functions into styled components, or we can sort of declare and utilize them inside of styled components. And this will get sort of rendered upon the usage of this styled component. So this utilizes props, and we've seen this before. Props are something that we pass into a component. So where has it passed it into a component? Let's take a look. So app.js, this defines global style, and this defines navbar. So these are all the different aspects of the navigation bar, and we can see, the data that is specific to those by going to navbar.js, and so this will use those styled components and pass the props into them. See right here, nav item button, primary. Let's go back over here. So this is checking if props, if primary is passed in as true to props, then it'll execute the second part of the code. So this gives us conditional CSS. We've seen conditional JS before. Now we also have access to conditional CSS. That's an incredible thing, because now we don't have to, again, like I said before, define two separate CSS states, which is really redundant. So we can set props that we pass into them, such as primary, which have their own sort of set of data, again, because nav item button is just a wrapper. Cool. So yeah, so I'm gonna actually take a pause right there. Do you guys have any questions so far?
I'm kind of like confused about the syntax overall. So are we having like a separate CSS and this like navbar.js, and this navbar.js is basically trying to dynamically change the CSS? Like, is that how that works?
Yes, exactly. So, well, it's not dynamically changing the CSS, it's dynamically applying different CSS attributes. So in this case, we're using this nav item button component, which is a wrapper for, like, I think it's like a normal navigation div. Let's see here. Yes, it's a nav item, which is again defined right here. and nav item is wrapping around link. So actually, this is a really good example of like inheritance, CSS inheritance. So this sort of inherits from nav item and has all of its properties. And so we have this really specific nav item called nav item button that we can pass in props to. And based on what the status of those props are, we can choose whether or not to apply this right here. And this is the standard way of doing handling props inside styled components. So you can look to this as like a really good example of how to do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
So let me share this. Okay, so this will probably answer your question a little bit better. First of all, we have to download styled components whenever we use them. And we can pass in these dynamic values using this syntax right here, which we saw before. And so if we import CSS from styled components, which is one of the subcomponents of the styled components package, we can actually write this as CSS instead of making it its own sort of a like a string literal. And so yeah, so we have this. This is what I mean by extend CSS styling by using this styled function. The styled function allows us to inherit from different other divs that we've manually created, as well as components that already exist, as well as different sort of div types like button or nav or even input. And yeah, I really encourage you guys to download this extension styled components for VS Code because it'll give us all this really nice highlighting that we see here. Otherwise, our code editor will have a lot of trouble understanding what's happening when we define like a React style component, because it's not like a normal thing to do. So yeah, this is how it looks always. We have our normal CSS in here. And I think there's like a few differences between this is how this is done, but those differences are as sort of like minimal as the difference between JSX and writing like HTML. So that is stuff that we can find anytime we want. Yeah, so component libraries are, right, so yeah, we'll talk about component libraries next. So component libraries are pre-made components that we can use within our application and sort of use at will. And we often use these component libraries for a lot of things. For example, suppose you want to have like a really nice pie chart data visualization. We can use something from the React D3, I don't know, React D3 visualization, a component library, although that might not be the best example. We can use a lot of things from the design sort of architecture of companies that already exist. So we have this right here, these three examples that I've sort of, or these four examples that I decided to illustrate here. Material UI, it follows closely along Google's design principles. And so like going onto google.com, all of the components that you see on your screen are actually Google or Material UI components. And they're not necessarily built with React, but this is finding that React Material UI will give us the Reactified version of those components using the same sort of design philosophies. So if we go to materialui.com, if we go to Material UI, oh, they changed things a lot. Okay, so yeah, I guess I haven't used this in a while, but this is one way of using something like Material UI. Suppose we want something very specific. We want a component that gives us like a tooltip, right? This is a really common example where we hover over something and we get the ability to see like additional text or something else that's potentially even dynamic. So in this case right here, it says add left start, top end. These are all different components that have a tooltip feature. So let's look at the source code for this. If we want a tooltip that will give us a left start sort of additional text icon, we can see that right here. Position tooltips. This is the actual source code for the tooltip itself, for the use case of the tooltip itself that Material UI has chosen to give us. So for the left start, you can see it right here. And this would be exactly how you use the tooltip. We would just import tooltip from Material UI and pass in these props. So that's all that is. And so we have our very specific use case, and we could just use it at will, as long as we import the right things and then we install Material UI on start. And so similar to Material UI, we can use any of these different types of component libraries. We can use Semantic UI, and these open source component libraries. You can use Semantic UI as well, which you can see right here. And I think this is in Microsoft. Let me just check. Semantic UI. Yep. So this is actually a development framework, which is more or less synonymous with the component library, but it gives us a little bit more. It gives us a little bit more like customization in terms of how we write our CSS versus if we use something like Material UI, it's very difficult to change the actual CSS and the actual styling that's related to that component that we want to use. So we can't do anything. We can't do anything to like the actual delete thing. We can't make the text look different. But yeah, Semantic UI will allow us to do all these things. Okay, back over here. Gestalt is another sort of component library that I really like. It's the Pinterest component library. And so we can do all of the things that I described with Material UI. We can also do with Gestalt. And all these are open source, but there's a lot of like, I guess, proprietary component libraries as well. So yeah, like Oracle's component library, like OJet, is used for its proprietary framework that it uses, and we don't have access to that. But we can have access to all the open source stuff that they give us if we want it to look a similar way to that. React Bootstrap. Now that's a name that might seem familiar to you guys, because Bootstrap, I think, is something that you guys have worked with before. And so using Bootstrap with vanilla HTML and CSS involves creating applications that, or creating websites that have styling that is sort of pre-used. You can import Bootstrap or install Bootstrap into an application, and it'll automatically apply all of the Bootstrap related styling to your application wherever those divs are used. Similarly, React Bootstrap is really similar. It does something that is quite similar. So if you look at React Bootstrap, it's the most popular front-end framework, sure. And we have these, like a whole bunch of different ways of styling different types of divs. So let's just look at forms for a second. So this is a type of form that you've definitely seen before. It's all over the web, and it looks a lot like this, with a nice on-click background halo type functionality. We have checkable boxes, the submit button, all of those things. And we can use Bootstrap for all of them. So usually we would write form, and now we just write form with a capital F. It's very intuitive because Bootstrap can be used without knowing any CSS at all. And to be honest, I use Bootstrap quite a bit for my applications, because like when I don't care about like making things look pretty in a very particular way, I just use Bootstrap because I can demonstrate like the core functionality without distracting users with like really bad styling for the page. So I don't want to just spit out HTML and CSS. I just use React Bootstrap to make things look better. Yep, and so this is an example. These are a bunch of examples of how that would be used. Cool. So that is pretty much it for component libraries. The core idea is that we can, we can sort of import and use things at will. And I strongly encourage you guys to play around with a lot of them. So one place where we can find a lot of cool component libraries that I think are just like free is this place called bit.dev. So these slides are all on the Notion as well. You guys should look at some of the links that I provide. But yeah, we have all of these sort of UI libraries that we can just use as well as purchase. So yeah, so there's like a lot of them. Let's see. Can you guys sort of spit out like a couple of like component examples that we could use here? Yeah, just like say it in the chat if you want. Otherwise, I'll just come up with something. Okay, let's see. So I can say something like chart. And we have a bunch of like different types of charts. So we were talking about pie charts before. We can use this exact code and importing and installing this in order to achieve a pie chart like this with its own legend as well as its own color scheme and tooltips along with it. This is really nice, right? Like we don't have to do anything. We can just simply use it as it's shown right here. And that is one big part about what makes React really unique. And we can see a lot of these examples of cool React components right here in this repo that I've linked in the slides. And I want you guys to look at that when you guys have time. Yeah, and this is like separated really well by their categories. So cool. Cool. That is it for component libraries. We'll go through like a bit of a demo after this. Do you guys have any questions so far? No questions? Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, so back to this example right here. I wanted to talk about, so we actually didn't go over routing just yet. I think I was just going to explain it. Okay, so React Router, the actual like specification for how to use it is described really, really well inside the notes. And so I just want to give like an example of how this would work because it's better to like learn by example. So using non-React router syntax, we would define links to different pages. For example, links to the pricing page using the A anchor tag, right? So we would just anchor to a different page, and then our browser would manually like load all of the assets for that page, and those would get displayed on the screen. Instead of that, we use React Router. So if you think about it, we have our browser and we have a server, and every time the browser makes a request, it sends that request over the server, and the server responds with all the necessary assets. That's what happens when you initially load any page on any website. And so on a non-React website or a single page application, if you have an anchor link to a different page, it would send another server request, which would pass in different assets. But in a React context, the connection to the server is severed after the initial load for the first page. So we have an intermediary, which allows us to, which after like a server request is sent, for example, if we have this right here, route path exact component home. This means that if the user goes to /pricing, it'll send a request, like a normal like REST API request to the server, but before it reaches the server, it bounces off the React intermediary server, which then responds to all the assets that have already been loaded for that page. And that, as you would expect, significantly reduces load times. So we can see an example of that right here. we have this router thing which wraps around all of this, and we can specify specific routes inside the router. So using this path prop, which we set to a specific string. So for the slash string, if the user just has slash here, then it automatically redirects to the home component. And so what does this exact thing do? Well, let's delete it and see what happens. Okay, so now I go to app, and then I go to pricing. And if you notice, all of the stuff right here from home loads again, and all this stuff is just shoved to the bottom. Why does this happen? Does anybody have any ideas why this is happening right now? Yeah, just try to explain it. Raise your hand or just unmute your mic, and yeah, do you have any ideas? Come on, guys, let's get some engagement. Nobody? Okay, so this is happening because we didn't introduce the exact property for the root. And so so this is basically matching the path component, basically just path prop, sorry, just matches things like in a very like regular expression type of way. So if it has this like slash at the beginning of the path, and we don't have this exact thing right here, it'll just match everything that has a slash at the beginning. And pricing has a slash at the beginning, so it also renders the home component. And that's not what we want usually. Sometimes it is. So we have to specify exact when we don't want that. Okay, and that's it. We just use those routes at will. And there's a lot of different ways of implementing routing. There's dynamic routing and there's basic routing, which you guys will be able to see like in the notes as well. But let's take a look at this. So when this routes to this page right here, we can see the yeah, we can see that this is like a whole component in and of itself that inherits from split, or it uses the split component, which is again a styled component, and it has its own set of divs and everything. Let's look at the pricing page. Pricing does a very similar thing also. We have our different pricing cards that we were manually putting in here, which have their own subcomponents as well. And this is its own modularized component. So we don't have to worry about it after passing it, just like passing it into root. And one very special thing is that if we have, things like pricing /1 or pricing /2, and we want to make those look different, then we can also do that in a very dynamic way. So, so let me just share this right here, which should explain, which is like, I think a really good example of dynamic routing. So in this case, if we want, the question is like, if we have a route for every listing on Airbnb, and of course we don't want to make separate components for every single listing that looks different. So, so yeah, so in this case, we're exporting dynamic routing, and we're using this switch right here. And you guys might be familiar with like a switch is in like programming in general, but basically it allows us to switch between different routes and specify different components depending on the path. So we could have done that in the example that I showed you earlier as well. But this is usually a really good way of doing things when we have non-router things inside of a router wrapper. And so we say path and then :ID here, and we say children is equal to like a child component. And this ID is specified as a parameter for this path. So whenever we have like a different parameter, we can always, and so that parameter that we pass in depends on what the user passes in to the URL that we're trying to go to. So the colon right here indicates that it's not a prop that already exists, but a prop that the user is passing in manually via like, their API calls to a different page. And so using this, we can create an infinite number of different pages that all look different too, because this child component doesn't have to be like super simple, just displaying like the number. You can display any number of different kinds of things based on whatever conditional that you want to display. And that all depends on this idea of dynamic routing. Yeah, and so highly recommend understanding what this use params hook does.
Can you check the chat?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen. All right. So I'm actually just taking this from the notes right here. I don't know if you guys can see this now. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So yeah, just like as a recap, we have this example of dynamic routing, sorry, where we have like multiple, like an infinite number of routes that we can create, infinite number of components that we can spawn that all look different based on the use params hook, which specifies an ID and takes into account this ID that the user passes into the path. So if we have something like Facebook or let's see, github.com/user1 or github.com/user2, the profile will look a lot like very similar from user to user, but there will be key differences, right? Like everybody has different repositories, but the general outline of the page will be the same, depending on like whatever user it is. So it takes into account all of these different users all at once. This allows us to create really big applications. So does this make sense to you guys? Do you have any questions? Okay, cool. No questions at all? That's great. Okay, awesome. So yeah, I mean, this is